On the 29th of January 2018, a press release went out from the University of Alberta that would upend a mystery 6 centuries old. It announced that 2 computer scientists, using nothing but an artificial intelligence system and a public database of translated documents, had produced the first plausible sentence ever pulled from the most famous unreadable book on Earth. Reporters at Fox News, the Canadian Press, and Global News scrambled to get the story up within hours. Twitter erupted. For a brief, electric moment, it looked as though a problem that had swallowed the careers of cryptographers, linguists, and even Britain's most legendary code breakers had finally been cracked open by a machine. Then, within 72 hours, the same online community that had celebrated the announcement turned on it completely, and the fight that followed exposed just how little anyone actually understands about the strange object at the center of it all. That object is real. It sits inside Yale University's Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library, catalogued under the cold, bureaucratic label MS-408. Strip away the mythology for a second, and what you have is roughly 240 pages of animal skin vellum bound together and covered edge to edge in flowing, looping handwriting in an alphabet that does not match any known writing system in human history. Scientists at the University of Arizona ran radiocarbon dating on 4 separate samples of that vellum back in 2009, and they came back with a result they could state with 95% confidence. The skin the book is written on was prepared somewhere between 1404 and 1438, squarely in the early 15th century, generations before Columbus ever left port. The pages themselves feel like someone raided 3 different reference books and stitched the pieces together. There are botanical drawings of plants that match no known species on the planet, correct root structures paired with leaves and flowers that do not belong to them. There are circular star charts and zodiac diagrams. There are pages of naked women bathing in green pools connected by an unsettling network of tubes and pipes. Some scholars have compared to plumbing schematics or human anatomy. There are small jars that resemble pharmacy vessels, and there are dense unbroken blocks of handwritten text that look, structurally, exactly like recipes or instructions. Historians have sorted the manuscript into 6 broad sections based purely on which pictures sit next to which text, because nobody, in over 100 years of trying, has been able to read a single confirmed word of the writing itself. That is where the agreement ends and the chaos begins. Every professional code-breaking effort that has ever been thrown at this book has failed. During the Second World War, and after it, members of the legendary team that broke the German Enigma cipher at Bletchley Park reportedly took a run at the Voynich script and got nowhere. American and British cryptanalysts working through the 20th century treated it as a personal insult, a puzzle simple enough to look solvable and stubborn enough to never actually break. So when a natural language processing lab decided to point a machine learning system at it instead of a human brain, the entire community of Voynich obsessives sat up and paid attention. The 2 researchers behind the January 2018 breakthrough were Greg Kondrak, a computing science professor at the University of Alberta, and his graduate student, Bradley Hauer. Kondrak had spent his career building software that helps computers make sense of the tangled, ambiguous nature of human language, and he decided the Voynich Manuscript was the ultimate stress test for that kind of tool. Instead of trying to translate the words on the page directly, the way every failed attempt before them had tried and failed to do, Kondrak and Hauer built an algorithm designed to answer a completely different question first. Not what does this book say, but what language is it even written in? To do that, they fed their AI system translated copies of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in roughly 400 different languages, training it to recognize the statistical fingerprints that distinguish one language's letter patterns from another's, achieving something close to 97% accuracy at spotting a language from its patterns alone during testing. Then they pointed that trained system at the actual Voynich script. Kondrak and Hauer both expected the answer to be Arabic. Multiple earlier theories, floating around the Voynich research community, had pointed in that direction, given the manuscript's geographic and historical context. Instead, the algorithm came back with something nobody on the research team was expecting: Hebrew. Not Arabic, not Latin, not some invented artificial code. According to the statistical model, encoded Hebrew was the most likely language sitting underneath that impossible alphabet. Kondrak told reporters at the time that the result genuinely surprised him. Getting an answer at all was only step 1, though. Knowing a language exists underneath a cipher does not mean you can suddenly read the cipher, and Kondrak said as much publicly. The team needed a theory for how the letters had actually been scrambled. The theory turned out to be something called an alphagram. Picture taking every letter in a word, stripping out the vowels, and then rearranging what's left into strict alphabetical order. The same basic principle behind a jumbled anagram puzzle. Kondrak and Hauer built a second algorithm specifically to reverse that kind of scrambling, essentially trying to unscramble each word back into something that existed in a real Hebrew dictionary. When they ran the first several pages of the actual manuscript through this unscrambling process, something remarkable happened. More than 80% of the resulting words matched real entries in a Hebrew dictionary. That number alone was enough to get the paper accepted into a respected peer-reviewed journal, Transactions of the Association for Computational Linguistics, one of the most rigorous outlets in the entire field of computational language research. But having 80% of your unscrambled words exist in a dictionary is not the same as having a sentence that makes any grammatical sense strung together. Kondrak and his team searched for a historian of ancient Hebrew willing to look over their results and confirm whether the unscrambled words actually formed coherent phrases. When they could not find one willing to take on the project, they made a decision that would later blow up in their faces publicly. They ran their unscrambled Hebrew text through Google Translate, a free consumer tool built to handle modern conversational Hebrew, never designed to parse a possibly 600-year-old, deliberately scrambled dialect. The output from that Google Translate pass became the sentence that made headlines around the entire planet. Pulled from the opening lines of the manuscript, roughly translated, it read close to this. She made recommendations to the priest, man of the house, and me and people. Kondrak told journalists the sentence was grammatical and could be interpreted as meaningful, and he called it a genuine step forward. Within hours, outlets from Fox News to the Canadian press were running headlines declaring the world's most mysterious manuscript finally decoded. The celebration lasted almost no time at all. Voynich researchers and medieval scholars who had spent decades with this manuscript began picking the finding apart within days of it hitting the news cycle. Damian Fleming, a medievalist at Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, mocked the entire result publicly on social media almost immediately, posting a sarcastic response that spread through the small but fiercely opinionated online Voynich research community within hours. His actual objection was more precise than simple mockery, though. Fleming and other critics were not necessarily attacking the language identification statistics, which used legitimate, defensible statistical methods that many linguists found genuinely interesting. Their target was the final translation step, the decision to run a scrambled, centuries-old, dead dialect through a piece of consumer software engineered for people booking hotel rooms in modern Tel Aviv. Critics pointed out something that stung because it was true. Nobody with actual expertise in historical or biblical Hebrew had verified that Google Translate's output reflected anything a real 15th century scribe might have intended to say. Kondrak himself had already admitted, before the backlash even hit its peak, that full confirmation of any meaning inside the manuscript would require a genuine historian of ancient Hebrew willing to take the project further, someone the team had been unable to recruit. Longtime Voynich researchers reminded everyone paying attention that this exact pattern, a loud triumphant announcement followed by total silence, once nobody could reproduce the results, had played out repeatedly across more than a century of failed decoding attempts. This would not be the last time it happened either. A little over a year later, in May of 2019, the pattern repeated itself with even more institutional weight behind it, because this time, it was not just two independent researchers making noise online. It was an entire university putting its name and its press office behind the claim. The University of Bristol announced that one of its own researchers, an honorary research associate named Dr. Jared Cheshire, had cracked the manuscript's code in just 2 weeks. Cheshire's theory bypassed AI entirely and went back to old-fashioned linguistic detective work, arguing the text was written in what he called proto-romance, a hypothetical, previously undocumented early ancestor of modern Italian, Spanish, and French. His paper, published in the academic journal Romance Studies, claimed the manuscript covered women's health topics, herbal remedies, and therapeutic bathing practices, and he described experiencing what he called a series of eureka moments while cracking the code. News organizations ran with it instantly. CNN covered it. The BBC covered it. Within a single day, the story had traveled across multiple continents, framed almost identically to the AI story from the year before, as the definitive solving of history's most famous unsolved book. And then, just as quickly, the professional backlash arrived, this time even faster and more brutal than what had greeted Kondrak and Hauer. Lisa Fagan Davis, executive director of the Medieval Academy of America, published a blistering public response, calling the entire concept of a proto-romance language nonsense, describing it as aspirational, circular, self-fulfilling reasoning built on nothing solid. She revealed that she had actually attempted to reproduce Cheshire's method herself years earlier, out of genuine curiosity, and found that his letter substitution system fell apart the moment you tried applying it with any consistency. According to Davis, the translation process was fundamentally subjective, meaning a researcher could bend the same set of symbols into whatever words fit, whatever narrative they had already decided was true, and then present that outcome as objective proof. Once that foundational methodology collapsed under scrutiny, she argued, everything built on top of it, including the peer-reviewed paper itself, collapsed along with it. The fallout moved even faster than the news cycle had. Within roughly 2 days of the original announcement, the University of Bristol quietly pulled its own press release off its website entirely, publishing a statement explaining that concerns had been raised by academics in linguistics and medieval studies about the validity of the research, and clarifying that the work had been done entirely on the researcher's own initiative, rather than as an official university project. Two major globally reported claims of victory, one built on cutting-edge machine learning, one built on old-school philology, both collapsing within days of outside experts actually looking closely at the evidence. And these were not even the only failed attempts on record. Back in 2017, a television history researcher named Nicholas Gibbs published his own theory in the Times Literary Supplement, arguing the manuscript was assembled from Latin ligatures, a kind of medieval scriptorial shorthand where clusters of letters were fused into single symbols, similar to how the modern ampersand quietly fuses the Latin word for and into one mark. Gibbs concluded the entire book functioned as a women's health manual compiled from existing medical treatises of the era. His theory made global headlines too, briefly. It also collapsed almost immediately once historians pointed out that his supposed translated lines did not actually form coherent grammatical sentences, and that no index of these supposed abbreviations existed anywhere to make his system verifiable or testable by anyone else. There was a fourth attempt too, quieter than the others, but just as revealing. In 2014, a British linguistics professor named Stephen Bax claimed to have identified the proto-readings of around 14 individual words scattered throughout the manuscript, working letter by letter using the names of plants and stars illustrated directly next to certain passages as a kind of visual Rosetta Stone. Bax was careful compared to Cheshire and Gibbs, explicitly calling his work a provisional, partial result rather than a full decipherment. Even so, other researchers pointed out that 14 scattered words still fell dramatically short of a readable sentence, and Bax's approach never gained the independent confirmation needed to stand as a real breakthrough. Which brings up an uncomfortable question that none of these four separate teams, using four completely different methods across 4 different decades, has ever satisfactorily answered. What if there is nothing to translate at all? What if the entire 600-year-old mystery is not a lost language waiting to be cracked, but an elaborate, meaningless hoax, and everyone chasing a translation has simply been fooled by an extremely convincing magic trick? That theory has a name and a champion. In 2004, a researcher named Gordon Rugg, then working at Keele University, published a paper in the respected cryptography journal Cryptologia, proposing something radically different from a language hypothesis. Rugg argued the entire manuscript could have been mechanically generated using a device called a cardan grill, essentially a piece of cardboard or paper with strategically cut holes, laid over a large table filled with columns of word fragments, prefixes in one column, root syllables in another, suffixes in a third. Slide the grill across the table in a repeating pattern, and you can generate an essentially endless stream of new words that all share consistent language-like internal structure without a single one of them meaning anything whatsoever. Rugg pointed directly at the manuscript's genuinely strange word-length pattern as supporting evidence, noting that it clusters in an unusually even, almost mathematically regular way that real spoken human languages essentially never produce naturally on their own. A hoax generated through a mechanical table and grill system, on the other hand, would produce exactly that kind of artificially uniform statistical signature because it is built from repeating structural blocks rather than organic human speech. There is one enormous problem sitting directly in the middle of Rugg's theory, though, and it is a problem of pure chronology. The cardan grill itself was invented and documented by an Italian mathematician named Girolamo Cardano in 1550. The Voynich Manuscript's vellum, according to that 2009 radiocarbon dating study out of the University of Arizona, was physically produced somewhere between 1404 and 1438. That gap is not small. It is more than a full century, meaning the supposed tool used to fake the manuscript did not exist yet when the manuscript's own physical material was created. Rugg has argued around this contradiction 2 separate ways over the years, suggesting either that some earlier, undocumented version of the grill technique existed and simply never survived in the historical record, or that the actual writing was added to genuinely old, pre-existing parchment stock decades or even a full century after that vellum was originally prepared. Neither explanation has fully satisfied critics on either side of the hoax debate, and the timeline gap remains one of the single most cited weaknesses of the entire cardan grill hypothesis. Underneath all of this sits an even stranger statistical puzzle, one that neither the AI language study nor the proto-romance claim nor the cardan grill hoax theory has ever cleanly resolved. Researchers studying the raw Voynich text applied a mathematical concept called information entropy, essentially a measurement of how predictable or repetitive a piece of writing is at the level of individual letters and word structure. Completely random gibberish, letters mashed together with no underlying system, tends to score extremely high on this measurement because nothing about it follows any kind of consistent internal pattern. Real? Naturally occurring human languages score much lower because certain letter combinations and word structures repeat constantly, the same way the letter Q is almost always followed by U in English. The Voynich script scores low too, closer to the pattern of a genuine human language than to pure random noise. On top of that, its words appear to follow strict internal rules about exactly which characters are permitted to appear at the beginning, middle, or end of a word, remarkably similar to real grammatical constraints found in actual spoken languages around the world. Researchers analyzing word distribution have also noted something scholars call courier languages A and B, two statistically distinct dialects or styles that shift depending on which section of the manuscript you are reading, almost as if two different scribes or two different modes of the same underlying system were at work across the text. To believers in a genuine hidden language, this is exactly the kind of evidence that keeps hope alive that real meaning is buried somewhere in there. To supporters of Rugg's mechanical hoax theory, it is precisely the kind of statistical signature his table and grill method can also accidentally produce purely through structural repetition rather than genuine linguistic meaning. Both camps can point at the exact same numbers and walk away with completely opposite conclusions, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how unresolved this entire field actually is. The uncertainty does not stop at the letters either. It extends all the way back through the manuscript's ownership history, a trail that is nearly as fragmented and unreliable as the text itself. The earliest confirmed owner most historians agree on is Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who ruled from 1576 until 1612 and reportedly purchased the manuscript for 600 gold ducats, believing at the time that it had been written by the medieval English philosopher Roger Bacon. That specific claim about the 600 ducat purchase price comes from a single surviving letter, written decades after the fact by a Prague physician named Johannes Marcus Marci, addressed to the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome. Historians have never located any entry inside Rudolph's actual imperial account books, confirming that purchase ever happened, which has led a significant number of serious researchers to treat the entire 600 ducat story as legend, rather than verified historical fact. From Rudolph, the manuscript is believed to have passed down to his court pharmacist, and eventually into the hands of an alchemist named Georg Barisch, who also could not read a word of it and reportedly begged Kircher for translation help back in 1639. After Barisch died, Marci inherited the manuscript himself and shipped it off to Kircher in Rome in 1665, along with that now famous letter explaining its supposed provenance. Then the book essentially vanishes from the historical record for close to 2 full centuries. It resurfaces in 1912 when a Polish antiquarian book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich discovered it sitting inside a chest at the Villa Mondragone, a Jesuit college near Rome, and purchased it on the spot, giving the manuscript the name it still carries today. Even Voynich's own personal account of exactly how he found the manuscript contains small, nagging inconsistencies when compared against a separate version of the story later written by his wife, Ethel Voynich, herself a published novelist. Those small contradictions are part of why a smaller, more radical theory has never fully gone away either. The idea that Wilfrid Voynich did not discover this manuscript at all, but actually created it himself sometime between 1900 and his purchase announcement in 1912, using genuinely old vellum scraps sourced from other decaying manuscripts to fake an authentically ancient appearance, then inventing the alien script and the bizarre illustrations from scratch, purely to inflate the value of a mysterious discovery on the international rare book market. Supporters of this theory point to Voynich's genuinely colorful past, which reportedly included forged passports and revolutionary political activity earlier in his life, as circumstantial evidence that he possessed exactly the skill set required to pull off this kind of long-term deception. They also point to the manuscript's handwriting, which appears remarkably uniform from the first page to the last, unlike most authentic medieval manuscripts of similar length and scope, which were typically copied out by several different scribes working together across a scriptorium. The 2009 radiocarbon dating result remains the single largest obstacle standing in the way of that particular Voynich forged it himself theory, since it confirms with 95% confidence that the vellum itself genuinely dates to the early 1400s, centuries before Wilfrid Voynich was even born. That single scientific test does not completely eliminate every possible version of a modern forgery argument, since old, genuinely medieval vellum could theoretically have been located and reused by a much later forger working closer to 1900. But it does mean the most widely repeated and dramatic version of the hoax theory runs directly into an extremely difficult piece of hard physical evidence standing squarely in its path. Beyond the ink on the vellum, researchers have also poured enormous effort into the illustrations themselves, hoping the pictures might crack open what the words refuse to. Botanist Arthur Tucker spent years cross-referencing the manuscript's unidentified plant drawings against species native to the Americas, arguing several of the illustrations closely resemble New World plants that Europeans would not have encountered before Columbus's voyages, a theory that, if true, would push the manuscript's likely origin toward the very end of its possible creation window, or even later, and which remains hotly disputed among botanists and historians alike. Multispectral imaging studies conducted directly on the physical pages at Yale have also revealed faint traces of erased or altered text underneath some of the visible writing, suggesting the manuscript itself may have been edited, corrected, or added to after its initial creation, another small but genuinely significant piece of the puzzle that complicates any theory, claiming the entire book was produced in one single continuous sitting. So after the AI language identification study, the Bristol proto-romance claim, the Nicholas Gibbs Latin ligature theory, the Carden-Grill hoax hypothesis, the entropy and word structure research, the botanical plant studies, and more than a century of gap-filled, half-legendary ownership records. Where does that actually leave anyone standing today? Nobody, across any of these approaches, using any combination of human expertise or artificial intelligence, has produced a translation that other qualified experts can independently reproduce and confirm as genuine. The AI work coming out of the University of Alberta gave researchers a legitimately useful statistical clue, a real peer-reviewed pointer toward Hebrew as a plausible root language, published in a journal respected across the entire field of computational linguistics. But the single sentence that made headlines around the world leaned on a modern consumer translation tool never built to handle a possibly 600-year-old, deliberately scrambled dead dialect. And Kondrak himself said publicly that full confirmation still requires an actual historian of ancient Hebrew willing to finish the work his team started. The Bristol claim collapsed within roughly 48 hours under nearly identical scrutiny from a completely different branch of linguistics. The Gibbs theory collapsed the same way, just as fast back in 2017. And the mechanical hoax theory runs headfirst into its own immovable wall in the form of that 2009 radiocarbon dating result, a piece of hard physical science that neither confirms nor destroys the hoax argument, but complicates it just enough that nobody can fully close the case in either direction. What the actual evidence supports, when you strip away every triumphant headline and every furious rebuttal, is not a solved mystery, and it is not a proven hoax either. It supports a nearly 600-year-old manuscript that keeps producing patterns real enough to tempt some of the sharpest scientific and linguistic minds on the planet into believing they have finally cracked it, and complicated enough to shatter every single one of those claims of victory within days of them being made public. The book sitting quietly inside Yale's rare book library right now has already outlasted Alan Turing's Codebreakers, an entire university's press office, a peer-reviewed AI language study, and over a century of professional cryptographers. Whatever it actually says, if it says anything at all, it has proven far better at keeping it secret than anyone alive has been at forcing it out.